Some people think looking away is a survival instinct. Turning a blind eye is actually how you kill your own soul. I watched the cartel hitman slip a compressed air neurotoxin syringe from his jacket. The threat was absolute. Beak Tijin stepped out of the lead SUV. He pulled his bespoke coat tight against the freezing rain. He coughed heavily into his hand, looking like a man exhausted by the weight of his own empire. Why should I care about a crime lord's execution? What fatal detail did I catch that his heavily armed guards completely missed? And if I fade into the shadows right now, what happens to my sense of self? I turned to run. My boots scraped the damp concrete. A sharp whimper from Marcus. A young runaway sleeping in the alcove behind me anchored my feet to the floor. I reached for my cracked burner phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad. Police sirens down here meant a city sweep. That would destroy the only shelter my street family had left. I looked back. I caught the eye of Cho, Tijin's trusted underboss. Cho saw the assassin's reflection in a puddle. He met my gaze. He deliberately turned his back. The attacker closed the distance. He was just a teenager wearing rival colors. His eyes held the desperate, hollow grief of a kid forced to avenge a murdered brother. I almost understood his vengeance. But if I step out from this rusted dumpster, I lose my invisibility. I endanger Marcus. I risk the fragile community I keep alive. This choice could destroy all of it. And that's when I realized I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing this because if I didn't, I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I watched a man die and did nothing. My bare hands gripped the jagged edge of my steel burn barrel. The rusted metal bit into my palms. It grounded me. Tijin stood 10 feet away. He studied a shipping manifest on the hood of his car. He was completely exposed. Intervening wasn't bravery. It was a sick obligation to life. I shoved the flaming barrel with everything I had. It roared across the wet asphalt. The blazing barrier crashed directly between the grieving teenager and the Mafia boss. The sudden heat triggered the ceiling sprinklers. Freezing water blasted downward. The overhead lamps shorted out. The syringe fired blindly into the hissing steam. Missed. I had broken the timeline. The crosshairs instantly shifted onto my own chest. I traded my safety for a man who didn't even know my name. If you have ever risked everything to do the right thing when walking away was easier, drop a comment below. What would you have done in that dark tunnel? Subscribe if you believe courage is defined by what you stand to lose. The immediate cost of the fire wasn't the blind gunfire sparking off the concrete walls. It was the absolute destruction of my sanctuary. Freezing water ruined the soaked cardboard my people relied on to survive the winter. I crouched low. My knees scraped broken glass. I wasn't terrified of the cartel. I feared my own exposure. Men in suits fanned out. Their tactical flashlights sliced through the steam. If they found me, they would ask questions. They would interrogate the other unhoused people. My hidden existence would be burned into the minds of killers. I had to calculate an exit, but my lungs refused to take a full breath. A hand clamped around my wrist. The grip felt like a steel vise. It was Tijin. Blood dripped from a graze on his cheek. His control was terrifying. He dragged me forcefully behind the reinforced engine block of the ruined SUV. I slammed against the cold metal. He had survived my chaotic intervention. Now I was hopelessly tangled in his violent world. He stared at me. His dark eyes registered the ragged layers of my thrift store coats. He was processing why a destitute woman just declared war on a cartel to save him. He opened his mouth to interrogate me. "Tossin." A panicked shout echoed over the broken water pipes. My blood turned to ice. It was Marcus. The 16-year-old boy crawled out of his hidden alcove. He clutched a heavy iron pipe. He stepped directly into the danger zone to defend me. The teenage cartel hitman spun toward the boy's voice. The true horror hit me a second later. Cho, the treacherous underboss, raised his own weapon. He wasn't aiming at the assassin in the steam. He aimed directly at Marcus. Cho was seizing the chaos to eliminate the witnesses to his staged betrayal. I lunged forward. I tackled Marcus to the wet pavement just as a suppressed round shattered the brick pillar right where his head had been seconds prior. Concrete dust rained over us. I was right to stop an execution. I was a fool to think the violence would remain contained to guilty men. We were bleeding on the floor of a war zone. The deadliest threat wasn't the rival cartel. It was the traitor standing shoulder to shoulder with the man I had just kept alive. We forced the rusted maintenance hatch open. We spilled onto the cracked linoleum of a 24-hour laundromat. The brutal bulbs assaulted my eyes. I blinked rapidly, fighting a sudden wave of nausea. Beak Tijin stumbled against a humming washing machine. Blood dripped heavily from his ruined sleeve onto the clean floor tiles. The lone night attendant dropped his magazine. He stared at the crimson pooling near Tijin's expensive leather shoes. His hand drifted toward the wall phone. Panic squeezed my throat. If he called the police, Cho's men would intercept the dispatch. We would be slaughtered right here between the dryers. "Do something," Tijin rasped. His good hand reached toward his concealed holster. He was calculating murder to buy our silence. I slammed my hand over his gun arm. I forced it down. I couldn't let him kill an innocent kid. I stripped off my filthy, oversized wool coat. I wrapped the heavy fabric tightly around Tijin's bleeding arm, masking the wound entirely. I shoved him onto a plastic waiting bench. I turned to the attendant. I didn't plead. I didn't explain. I just sank into the seat and stared at the floor. I adopted the exhausted, hollow posture of a woman who had nowhere else to go. I forced myself to become invisible. The teenager hesitated. He looked at my ragged clothes. He was deeply uncomfortable with my poverty. He chose the easiest path. He picked his magazine back up and turned his back. Tijin exhaled slowly. His dark eyes locked onto mine. He realized I hadn't just saved him from the cartel. I had just kept him from dropping another unnecessary body. That wasn't luck. That was instinct sharpened by pain. Comment, she knew, if you caught the exact moment this stopped being a rescue and became something deeper. Tijin bought me 10 minutes of safety. He walked me to the bus terminal 3 blocks down. He pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from his dry inner pocket and shoved it into my calloused hands. "The debt is settled," he said, his voice flat. "Vanish." He turned and disappeared into the rain. I stood under the flickering terminal overhang. My fingers dug into the crisp paper. This was enough money to start over in a city where nobody knew my face. I walked to the counter. I bought a one-way ticket out of state. My chest felt dangerously light. I thought I had actually survived. I sat on a hard plastic bench to wait for boarding. I stared blankly at the mounted television above the ticket kiosk. The breaking news banner flashed red. A live helicopter feed showed my overpass. The transit tunnel was consumed by a massive, unnatural fire. The newscaster's voice sliced through the noisy waiting room. Authorities are calling it a catastrophic gas main explosion. Several unhoused individuals are feared dead. The camera zoomed in. My stomach violently bottomed out. A stretcher was being loaded into an ambulance. A blackened, melted piece of a distinct blue sneaker hung off the edge. Marcus, the 16-year-old kid who tried to defend me with a pipe, was gone. Cho hadn't just cleaned up his mess. He had incinerated my entire street family to erase the trail. The cash in my pocket suddenly burned against my skin. It felt exactly like blood money. Tijin thought he paid off his debt. He didn't realize his enemies just transferred the cost of his life onto the only people I cared about. Walking onto that bus meant letting Cho butcher my people and get away with it. I crushed the bus ticket in my fist. She had every reason to walk away. She didn't. If that kind of heart means something to you, leave a comment for her. Some people survive by hardening. The rare ones survive and still choose humanity. I shoved the ruined bus ticket into my pocket. My hands shook violently. I pulled out the damp matchbook Tijin had dropped during our escape. It bore a single address stamped in gold foil. I was walking straight into the lion's den. Fear gnawed at my stomach, but the image of Marcus's burned shoe completely erased my hesitation. I found the address 20 minutes later. It was an upscale restaurant heavily guarded at the front. I didn't try the velvet ropes. I walked around to the loading dock. A delivery truck temporarily blocked the alleyway. I slipped past a smoking chef and pushed through the metal double doors. My filthy clothes made me entirely invisible in the chaotic kitchen. I kept my head down. I grabbed a stainless steel tray. A busboy shouted, but I didn't stop. I forced my way through a heavy oak door marked private. The noise of the kitchen instantly vanished. I stood inside a massive office. Tijin sat behind a mahogany desk. A private doctor was stitching his ruined arm. Tijin looked up, his face freezing in pure shock. I marched forward. I slammed the thick stack of $100 bills directly onto his desk. The doctor flinched, dropping his needle. "Your enemies missed you," I snapped, my voice trembling with raw rage. So they burned my family alive instead. T-Jin stood slowly. He dismissed the doctor with a sharp nod. He stepped around the desk, his physical dominance returning instantly. He grabbed my shoulder. His grip hurt. I refused to look away. I forced him to see the absolute devastation his survival had caused me. "You were paid to vanish," he whispered. "I can't vanish when my people are dead," I fired back, my nails digging into my palms. "You owe me more than money. You owe me blood." She stepped in while carrying more pain than anybody there could see. If that kind of heart means something to you, leave a comment for her. Some people survive by hardening. The rare ones survive and still choose humanity. Subscribe if you know the cost of looking away is always higher than the cost of staying. The heavy oak door slammed open. Cho stormed into the office. 2 armed men flanked him. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't breathe. This was the man who had just ordered a bomb dropped on sleeping teenagers. He froze when he saw me standing by the mahogany desk. His eyes widened slightly. It was a microscopic break in his cold mask. He quickly recovered and pointed a finger directly at my chest. "Detain her," Cho barked at his men. "She led the cartel to the tunnel. She is a massive security breach." The 2 guards lunged forward. I backed into the edge of the desk. My hands gripped the polished wood. I was utterly defenseless. T-Jin raised a hand, stopping the men inches from my face. He looked from Cho to me, calculating the sudden chaos. I needed to shift the power dynamic immediately, or Cho would put a bullet in my head the second I was dragged outside. I looked down. I stared at Cho's expensive leather shoes. My heart hammered against my ribs. There was a thick, chalky smudge of gray dust across the toe of his right Oxford. I knew that exact dust. It was the pulverized concrete from the sudden cave-in at the transit tunnel. The cartel had used it to block the north exit. Cho hadn't been anywhere near the street level during the ambush. I looked up at T-Jin. I fought to keep my voice steady. "Why does your underboss smell like the trap you barely survived?" The room went entirely dead. The silence was suffocating. Cho's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, pulling his right foot back a single inch. It was a tiny, guilty flinch. T-Jin noticed it. The boss slowly turned his head. He stared at Cho's shoes. "She's a desperate vagrant," Cho sneered, his voice rising in pitch. "She's lying to save her own life. Get her out of here." I didn't back down. I stepped directly toward T-Jin, risking everything. "I saved you. He handed you to a hitman. Look at his shoes." T-Jin didn't yell. He didn't pull a weapon. He just stared at his second-in-command with a terrifying, vacant calm. The power imbalance shifted violently. Cho's guards looked at each other, suddenly unsure who to protect. Cho reached inside his tailored jacket. He was going for his weapon. The entire room hung on a razor edge. I braced myself for the gunshot, praying I had pushed the dominoes in the right direction. The enemy was standing closer than the cartel. If you're still here, you're not watching casually anymore. You're reading people with her. Drop a fire in the comments if you felt that switch. T-Jin didn't shoot his betrayer. He simply stripped Cho of his weapon and shoved him out of the private office. The heavy oak door slammed shut. I was left entirely alone with a Mafia kingpin. My knees immediately buckled. I gripped the edge of the polished mahogany desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I had just exposed the second-in-command of a criminal syndicate. My chest heaved. I expected T-Jin to offer protection. Instead, he pulled a small black receiver from his drawer. He slammed it onto the desk. "Listen," T-Jin commanded. His voice held zero warmth. He pressed a silver button. A crackling audio feed filled the quiet room. It was a live surveillance bug planted inside Cho's vehicle. I held my breath. I heard the muffled hum of a car engine. Then came Cho's panicked, ragged breathing. He wasn't acting like a cold professional anymore. He sounded terrified of my moral clarity. "Get me the cartel contact," Cho barked over the transmission. A secondary voice clicked on the line. "The homeless woman ruined the tunnel hit. She's sitting in T-Jin's office right now." My stomach violently twisted. He knew exactly where I was. I looked at T-Jin, desperate for him to act. He just watched my terror with absolute calculation. He was actively testing my breaking point. "Burn her entire encampment," Cho ordered through the speaker. "The tent city under the South Bridge. Kill everyone living there until she surrenders herself to us." The blood completely drained from my face. My hands shook so hard I knocked a water glass off the desk. It shattered against the hardwood. The remaining survivors of my street family were sleeping under that bridge. I had already lost Marcus to the transit explosion. Now, Cho was going to slaughter the rest of them just to flush me out. I grabbed T-Jin's tailored sleeve. "Stop him," I pleaded. The power dynamic felt suffocating. I had no weapons. I had no money. I only had the fragile standing of a witness. T-Jin smoothly pulled his arm away from my grip. He didn't blink. Why should I risk my loyal men for vagrants? The refusal hit me like a physical blow. He was securing his empire, not my life. I had to bargain with a man who viewed human life as a simple ledger. "Because if Cho kills them," I whispered, forcing the words through a tight throat, "he proves to the streets that he has more power than you do." T-Jin's dark eyes narrowed. My manipulation struck his pride directly. He reached for his radio. He didn't save her because she was weak. He kept her close because even he knows rare is rare. Subscribe if you love stories where one fearless act changes the balance of power. T-Jin moved me within the hour. A heavily armored SUV transported me to a secure penthouse overlooking the city skyline. He assigned 2 of his personal guards to watch the steel front door. He promised absolute safety while he hunted down Cho's remaining loyalists. For the first time in 3 years, I locked a bathroom door behind me. I stripped off my filthy, smoke-ruined coats. I stood under the scalding spray of a glass shower. The hot water washed away the concrete dust, but it couldn't wash away my gnawing guilt. I stepped out and dressed in the clean, oversized sweatpants someone had left on the bed. I walked into the sprawling living room. The bulletproof windows muted the city sirens below. I sank into a massive leather sofa. My exhausted muscles finally went slack. I actually believed the impenetrable walls offered a true sanctuary. I closed my eyes, letting a heavy, false peace settle over my chest. Tap, tap, tap. My eyes snapped open. The rhythmic, metallic clicking cut through the silent room. I turned my head slowly. One of the guards stood near the kitchen island. His fingers were drumming a specific, nervous beat against the handle of his holstered gun. My lungs froze. My false safety violently shattered. I knew that exact rhythm. I had heard that frantic tapping echoing in the dark transit tunnel right before the assassin raised his neurotoxin syringe. The man standing 10 feet away wasn't T-Jin's loyal guard. He was the cartel hitman who had tried to execute us. Cho had already infiltrated the safe house. I didn't scream. Screaming would force him to draw the weapon. My mind raced through terrifying calculations. The second guard stood by the door, completely oblivious. If I warned him, the hitman would gun us both down before anyone could react. I had to suppress my rising panic. I forced my shaking hands flat against my thighs. The hitman stopped tapping. He slowly turned his head. His cold eyes locked onto mine. He knew that I recognized him. The shift in his posture was microscopic but lethal. His hand gripped the weapon tighter. The countdown timer instantly reset. The threat hadn't been eliminated. It had just evolved and locked me in a high-rise cage. I had nowhere to run. I had to disarm him using the only tool I had left. I stood up, pretending my knees weren't giving out, and walked directly toward the kitchen. She saved his life once, and now the darkness knows her name. Subscribe before you leave if you're the kind of viewer who stays loyal when the story gets heavier. The next move won't be about survival alone. My legs felt like hollow iron. I forced myself to walk toward the marble kitchen island. The disguised hitman tracked my movement. His hand shifted to unclip his holster. My pulse hammered wildly against my throat. I couldn't scream for the door guard. The assassin would shoot us both before the heavy lock turned. I grabbed the glass coffee pot. The heat burned my palm. I needed a weapon. Throwing boiling liquid would only buy me 1 second. He would still pull the trigger. I took a slow, calculated breath. I poured 2 dark mugs. I slid one across the smooth counter toward him. He didn't blink. He didn't reach for the ceramic cup. He just stared at my chest, picking his target. The power imbalance was total. I had to destabilize his mind. "You're shaking," I whispered. I pushed the words past the dry lump of pure fear in my throat. I needed him to see me as human. His finger twitched. The gun cleared the leather holster. The metallic scrape sounded incredibly loud. "Shut your mouth," he hissed. "I know you lost a brother," I said. My voice wavered. I anchored my hands to the cold marble. I couldn't let him see them trembling. I gambled my life on a fleeting expression I witnessed hours ago. I saw your face in the tunnel. You aren't doing this for a cartel paycheck. You want vengeance. He froze. The gun hovered inches above the counter. His eyes widened slightly. He was absorbing the shock that a homeless woman recognized his private grief. His professional mask cracked. I pushed harder. I had to force the weight of murder onto his conscience. If you pull that trigger, the grief doesn't vanish, I pressed. I stepped 1 inch closer. I risked a fatal shot. It just transfers to someone else. You become the exact monster who ruined your family. His breath hitched. He looked down at the steaming coffee, then back to my face. His hand visibly trembled. He was hesitating. That microscopic delay of human guilt cost him everything. The steel front door suddenly clicked open. T-Jin walked inside. He instantly read the assassin's drawn weapon and the trembling hand. T-Jin didn't hesitate. He drew his own pistol and fired twice. The deafening shots shattered the quiet room. The hitman collapsed violently against the cabinets. Blood pooled on the polished hardwood. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air. I had used a grieving boy's trauma to keep myself alive. I weaponized his humanity to orchestrate his death. She saved his life once, but the cost was her own innocence. If you have ever crossed a moral line, you can never uncross just to survive. Hit subscribe. Comment if you understand the crushing guilt of doing the wrong thing for the right reason. I refused to stay in that blood-stained penthouse. T-Jin's syndicate was completely compromised. The dead hitman proved his own security forces were hunting us. I demanded we leave his territory entirely. I needed a sanctuary built on faith, not bullets. We slipped out through the service elevator. I led the Mafia boss through the freezing rain toward the basement doors of Grace Mission. Pastor Elias ran the underground soup kitchen. He had known me for a decade. He was the one man I trusted with my life. Elias opened the heavy wooden doors. He wore his faded cardigan. He immediately ushered us out of the biting wind. He didn't ask why a bruised billionaire was following a destitute woman into a church basement. He just bolted the iron locks. Elias guided us to his private office. The cramped room smelled of old paper and peppermint. He handed me a worn quilt. I wrapped it tightly around my shaking shoulders. My terrified heart finally began to slow down. I was off the grid. Cho couldn't track us here. "Drink this, Tossin," Elias said softly. He placed a steaming, chipped mug of tea into my hands. "You are safe now." I brought the ceramic edge to my lips. I drank deeply. The warm liquid coated my throat. I sighed. I closed my eyes for the first time in 24 hours. Relief washed over me. Then, my fingers went entirely numb. The chipped mug slipped from my grip. It shattered against the concrete floor. Hot tea splashed across my boots. I tried to stand up. My legs buckled violently. I crashed back into the folding chair. My vision blurred. The edges of the small room rapidly darkened. Panic instantly replaced my false peace. I looked at Elias. The pastor wasn't rushing to help me. He stood perfectly still near the locked door. His hands were clasped tightly together. His knuckles were completely white. He was sweating heavily. T-Jin noticed my collapse. He reached for his concealed weapon. His movements were suddenly sluggish. His own tea was already affecting his nervous system. He swayed on his feet. "I am so sorry, Tossin," Elias whispered. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek. The guilt in his voice was suffocating. "Cho's men found us an hour ago. He promised to fund the mission forever. He guaranteed no one else on the street would starve this winter." The betrayal shredded my remaining sanity. The safe person wasn't safe. The ultimate sanctuary was a fatal trap. I had traded the lives of my friends for the life of a crime boss. Now my own pastor was trading me to feed the poor. My chin dropped to my chest. The crushing darkness pulled me under. I spit through my thin sweatpants. The extreme cold shocked my nervous system awake. My wrists burned against thick zip ties. I thrashed against the heavy metal chair, swallowing a sharp spike of pure panic. Cho stood directly in front of me, his breath plumed in the freezing meat locker. He aimed a suppressed pistol right between my eyes. I refused to look away. If I died in this butcher shop, I vowed he would have to watch me see it. "Your street morality ruined a $50 million transition," Cho sneered. He stepped closer. The icy barrel pressed against my forehead. I calculated my absolute lack of leverage. I had nothing left to bargain with. Pastor Elias sold you for pennies. Your loyalty means nothing in this city. My stomach twisted violently. The reminder of my trusted pastor's betrayal hurt worse than the freezing air. I braced for the fatal gunshot. The reinforced steel door buckled inward with a deafening crash. Tijin stepped through the warped frame. Blood stained his tailored shirt. He didn't hesitate. He didn't issue warnings. He fired twice. Cho's two armed flankers dropped before they could raise their rifles. Cho spun wildly, firing a panicked round that ricocheted off a rusted meat hook. Tijin lunged forward. He drove a brutal, calculated kick into Cho's knee. The joint shattered audibly. Cho collapsed, screaming in agony. His pistol clattered across the slick, icy floor. I gasped for air, the crushing pressure in my chest finally breaking. Tijin grabbed a dropped combat knife. He stepped behind my chair and sliced through my plastic bindings. I stumbled forward. My numb legs immediately failed. Tijin caught my shoulder, his grip steady and fiercely protective. We stood together in the freezing room. Cho writhed on the frost-covered tiles. The syndicate traitor was finally neutralized. The violent coup was over. I let myself believe the nightmare had ended. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath, tasting a brief, desperate sliver of victory. He didn't abandon her when her own pastor did. He tore down a steel door to prove her life mattered. If you believe loyalty is earned in blood, hit subscribe. Drop a comment if you felt that massive wave of relief. Cho suddenly started laughing. The wet, ragged sound cut through the humming freezer generators. He clutched his shattered knee. He wasn't looking at Tijin. He stared directly at my face. A sickening realization gripped my throat. He hadn't brought me here just to kill me. He brought me here to stall. The transit tunnel was just business, Cho choked out, coughing blood onto the ice. But you embarrassed me, so I wired the foundation of the downtown mission shelter. The timer hits 0 in 12 minutes. My entire street family was sleeping inside that building right now. Women, children, and elderly vagrants hiding from the freezing rain. My chest completely caved in. I bolted toward the heavy metal door. Tijin grabbed my arm, jerking me backward with terrifying force. "No," he commanded. His voice was absolute ice. "You will die trying to disarm a cartel explosive. We are leaving the city right now. Those lives are an acceptable loss for our survival." He was sacrificing my people to secure his own escape. The Mafia boss had returned. He viewed human beings as a simple mathematical equation. I didn't calculate the risk. I didn't care that he was a lethal killer. I twisted my body and drove my open palm directly into his face. The sharp smack echoed through the meat locker. Tijin stumbled back half a step. His dark eyes widened in genuine shock. No one had ever struck the king of the West Coast Syndicate and lived. My hand throbbed violently. I stepped into his personal space, completely erasing the power dynamic. "They are dying because I saved your miserable life," I screamed, my voice cracking with absolute desperation. I grabbed the lapels of his ruined shirt. "You have an army, you have helicopters. For once in your useless, violent existence, do something fundamentally selfless. Or you can shoot me right here because I am not walking away." I demanded a monster act like a savior. He stared down at my furious, tear-streaked face. The heavy silence forced a monumental choice. If you would risk your own life to scream the truth into a monster's face, leave a comment right now. Subscribe if you know that true courage means refusing to sacrifice the innocent. The ultimate test of power is what you do when you have nothing to gain. I slammed my shoulder against the passenger door of the stolen sedan. Rain lashed the windshield violently as Tijin tore through the red light. My chest tightened with every passing second. We had 9 minutes before Cho's bomb reduced the downtown shelter to ash. I gripped the cracked leather dashboard, calculating the impossible distance. We would never make it in time. My entire street family was going to burn because I had saved a mobster. Tijin gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clamped shut. He was actively calculating his syndicate's survival against the lives of absolute strangers. "My extraction team is waiting at the docks," he stated flatly. He refused to look at my terrified face. His logic was brutal and entirely self-serving. He intended to let the shelter collapse to secure his own escape route. I grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, jerking his shoulder hard. The car swerved sharply on the slick asphalt. "Call your men," I demanded, my voice cracking with pure desperation. I risked a fatal crash just to force his hand. You have a private army sitting idle in this city. Send them to the shelter right now. He slammed the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the empty intersection. His dark eyes locked onto mine. I expected him to pull his weapon and end my defiance. My lungs froze. I braced for the fatal consequence of my demand. Instead, the Mafia boss reached for the heavy two-way radio clipped to his belt. He pressed the transmission button. "All available units," T-Jin ordered. His voice sliced through the static, completely devoid of hesitation. "Divert to the downtown mission shelter. Evacuate the building immediately." He dropped the radio. He had just surrendered his tactical advantage to save people he considered entirely worthless. The shock knocked the breath out of me. The king of the West Coast had just bowed to a homeless woman's absolute terror. He didn't save her because she was weak. He kept her close because even he knows rare is rare. Subscribe if you love stories where one fearless act changes the balance of power. T-Jin slammed the sedan onto the crowded sidewalk directly in front of the shelter. 4 black SUVs were already screeching to a halt around us. Heavily armed syndicate enforcers kicked through the reinforced glass doors. I shoved my door open, my legs shaking violently as my boots hit the freezing pavement. Mafia killers were violently dragging confused elderly men and screaming children out into the cold night air. The brutal efficiency was terrifying, but it was saving their lives. I scanned the terrified crowd frantically. My stomach dropped completely. I didn't see Maya, the young mother I had sworn to protect. I calculated the missing faces in a split second. She was still trapped in the West Wing. T-Jin grabbed my arm, reading my panicked realization instantly. "Stay by the car," he commanded, his grip bruising my skin. I ripped my arm away. I sprinted directly toward the shattered entrance. I defied a Mafia boss to run straight into a rigged death trap. Enforcers yelled for me to stop. I ignored them, plunging into the dark, chaotic hallway. Smoke already curled from the basement vents, burning my throat. I coughed violently, forcing myself forward through the absolute panic of fleeing residents. I reached the West Wing stairwell. The timer in my head screamed that the 12 minutes were gone. I grabbed the metal railing, preparing to climb. A deafening roar swallowed all sound. The concrete floor violently buckled beneath my boots. Cho's explosive detonated with catastrophic force. The brick wall beside me completely disintegrated. A wall of blistering heat slammed into my chest. I was thrown backward through the air, completely helpless. My shoulder struck the pavement outside with a sickening crunch. The entire West Wing collapsed in a horrific cascade of screaming metal and pulverized rock. Dust choked my lungs. I scrambled blindly in the debris, my hands bleeding, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what my interference had just cost. She stepped in while carrying more pain than anybody there could see. If that kind of heart means something to you, leave a comment for her. Some people survive by hardening. The rare ones survive and still choose humanity. The sterile hospital air burned my lungs. I sat beside Maya's bed, my hand crushing the thin white blanket. The doctor's words echoed violently in my skull, permanently paralyzed below the waist. My chest caved in completely. I stopped a bullet meant for a billionaire, but Maya paid the permanent price. Guilt suffocated me. I couldn't look at her sleeping face without hatting myself. I forced my jaw shut, refusing to let the tears fall. The heavy door clicked shut. I stiffened, calculating the threat before I even turned my head. Beak T-Jin stood at the foot of the bed. He wore no bespoke suit today. He looked haggard, entirely stripped of his arrogant armor. He stared at Maya, absorbing the brutal collateral damage of his survival. "I bought the hospital," he stated quietly. "Her care is covered forever." I stood up. My bruised shoulder screamed in sudden pain. "Money doesn't fix a broken spine," I whispered bitterly. I wanted to strike him. I wanted to blame his existence for her destroyed life. T-Jin didn't flinch or defend himself. He met my furious gaze with a terrifying, absolute vulnerability. "You broke the man I used to be," T-Jin confessed. His voice fractured, revealing a deep, agonizing crack in his soul. "I let my own men burn while I secured my empire. You sacrificed everything for strangers. You proved my power is entirely hollow." The shift terrified me. The king of the West Coast Syndicate was bowing to a homeless woman's conscience. I finally understood the brutal math of the streets. The cost of looking away is always higher than the cost of staying. T-Jin reached slowly into his coat. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a charred, sealed envelope recovered from the shelter debris. He placed it carefully on the mattress beside Maya's hand. My blood turned to ice. My name was written on the front in perfect, precise Korean calligraphy. Cho was dead, but the cartel wasn't. They didn't just want T-Jin anymore. I had stepped into a war, and the next strike was pointed directly at me. She saved his life once, and now the darkness knows her name. Subscribe before you leave if you're the kind of viewer who stays loyal when the story gets heavier. The next move won't be about survival alone.